I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's College London, and it's a real pleasure to welcome so many of you to this event on the return of President Trump and whether inequality has played a role in the US election outcome and what that may mean for lots of other places. So this is the latest in our partnership with the Fairness Foundation, part of our Fair Society series. And it's also part of a great series of events and research projects we've been running with Liam Byrne, building on his work as co-chair of the APPG on inclusive growth and his excellent book, The Inequality of Wealth, which I've just noticed, coincidentally, is on sale at the back of the room. So do pick up a copy. Excellent book. And the sorts of questions we're interested in this evening are what role did surging inequality in the US have in the Democrats' defeat and Republican success? And then what implications and lessons does that have for us here in the UK, including how the current UK government should respond? And it's clearly a really complex relationship between inequality and populism. We have some sign of that with the prominence of billionaires in President Trump's team and supporters, and the popular appeal that that has for people. And we've seen lots of shocked media coverage in the UK around the president and team's early actions, and public opinion here has moved in negative directions. But important to recognise that opinion in the US has not moved greatly, it seems, and lots of support for some of those actions, particularly among Republicans. It's true that the president's popularity at the start of his term is the lowest that Gallup have ever measured in their long history of this. It's basically a 50-50 split. But it's actually not much different from his first term, and it's more a sign of a country that's deeply divided in two along party lines. So I suppose there's temptation in that sort of circumstances to see this as purely a culture wars debate, where we're seeing a cultural backlash between two tribes facing off against each other. But I think that's wrong, or at least not the full picture of what's going on here. We see so much in our work that we do on culture wars and inequality that there's an interplay between those two. And you can't really fully understand what you should do by only looking through one of those lenses, we think. And great work by people you'll hear from tonight along that strand as well. So loads to discuss. And we're going to start with reflections from Liam Byrne, who's of course MP for Birmingham, Hodge Hill and Surrey Hill North and chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee. Then we'll have thoughts from a truly high-powered panel, brilliant panel tonight, of Professor Ben Ansell, who's Professor of Comparative Democratic Institutions at Nuffield, Oxford, and author of Why Politics Fails. Then Hamida Ali, who's Head of Policy and Programmes at the Future Governance Forum. Then Claire Ainsley, who's Director of the Project on Centre-Left Renewal at the Progressive Policy Institute and former Executive Director of Policy for Sir Keir Starmer. And then finally, Peter Hyman, who's co-director of Big Education and former senior advisor to Sir Keir Starmer as well. So, and after all of that great insight that we're going to get, we'll have time for questions from you. So let's crack on. First, we'll hear from Liam. Please, Liam Byrne.
Bobby, thank you so much indeed for that introduction. So I'm not going to talk for very long. As we say, we have friends in Westminster we've not spoken to for days because we didn't want to interrupt them. Westminster is full of politicians who talk too much. So I'm just going to share sort of three thoughts, really, to get the conversation going tonight, because as much as you, I want to hear from the panel, which has just done, this panel full of people here who have done an enormous amount to influence my thinking. And so let me just sort of kick off with the book. So Bobby, you very kindly hosted me last year to launch this here. And the argument in the book was that something is profoundly going wrong in our economy now. Look back since 2010, top 1% multiplied their wealth by about 41 times more than everybody else. And what you see in my business in politics is that you can't have shifts like that without a political effect on polling day. And so what I was interested to see in the American elections was whether there were some patterns that basically confirm that thesis, that inequality, and in particular wealth inequality, has profound and dangerous political effects. And of course, I am talking to you here tonight on the day when Reform polling has just outstripped the Labour Party for the first time. I am grateful to Bobby Duffy for telling me that I shouldn't read too much into one poll. But, you know, I think it's something that we need to worry about. So what I sort of pulled out of the American elections were obviously the bits that told me about inequality and more. And so many of us on the left have been looking hard at Bidenomics and saying, yeah, we need a bit of that. That's exactly the kind of stuff that we want here. But you know, what you'll see from these numbers is that for all of the money that President Biden was investing, actually when you looked at real wages, in particular the bottom 50%, the real wages of the bottom 50%, actually they didn't rise. And so it would be odd, frankly, if you had an economic effect like that and still had an overwhelming victory for the incumbent. So for all of the money that President Biden invested, there was a real risk of what is called deliverism, just hoping that raising the money and spending the money will deliver you an election victory. Unless you attend to what is actually going on in people's incomes, then actually you're in some political peril. And you know what is really striking, this is some numbers that Kelly Beaver from Ipsos Mori shared with us last night in Oxford, is that it's not just that people feel there's a problem with their pay packets, they actually feel that there is a problem with the system. They feel that the system, frankly, is broken. So this pulls together what I love this title, the Ipsos Broken System Index. And so, you know, questions that they ask are things like, the economy is rigged to the advantage of the rich and powerful, experts in this country don't understand the lives of people like me. And what you see across United States, Britain, and France is some persistence in this idea that things are broken. But what appears to have happened, I think, at this election is that confidence has fallen to such a low point that people are now deeply, profoundly, fundamentally pessimistic about the future and whether mainstream politicians have it within them to actually fix this broken system and remedy the problem in their pay packets. And so for me, this takes us to something of a challenge for progressive politics, because even when you look at how confident people are in, say, Donald Trump's ability to fix the problems that trouble them most, actually their confidence levels are quite low. But what I think President Trump has managed to pull together is three things that we need to really understand. One, a sense of a plan. A sense of a plan that things are actually going to improve. A sense of a plan that is rooted in the frustration that people have had for some time about what's going on with their living standards. Second, President Trump has married that to a story about the machine to deliver. If you look at that inauguration speech, a good fraction of that speech is all about state breakdown. It's playing on that notion that people think that the state is broken and that, you know, in his prescription, it needs kind of shutting down, starting again. But the third thing that he's got, of course, is a story that is deeply patriotic. And all of these things have fundamental lessons for us. So, I mean, I'm sure that many people in here will have read our government's plan for change, and you'll be able to tell me all about the missions and the milestones. But I don't think many of us here tonight would say that that really amounted to a story, a narrative, a patriotic account of how we were going to rejuvenate our country. And so for me, there's an awful lot at stake and there's an awful lot to learn. But for me, the fundamental core of it is an economic offer that raises not just income, but wealth, where we ask ourselves the question, have we really got the kind of state that we need in order to deliver that change? But crucially, have we married that to a story about how, as we used to say in 1997, things can only get better? I'm not sure we've got, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that after we've heard from our brilliant panel. Thank you so much.
seats come through. Yeah.
You go here. Okay.
Yes, very good. You're up here. Great. So, excellent. Thank you, Liam, for setting that scene. I just going to follow the order that I got on my briefing, which actually Ben to go first. We're going to hear from each of the panelists for 5, 6, 7 minutes, just on their reflections, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then over to you, Ben.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm delighted I'm getting to speak first to this crowd because I'm a person whose last name begins with an A, and yet there are two people who are ahead of me in the alphabet here. But nonetheless, I appear to have reclaimed my usual position. I was asked by Bobby and Sophia, who helped organize this, to talk about wealth inequality and Donald Trump. And there's a couple of things I wanted to do in that vein. Bobby mentioned that inequality has been surging in the US. Liam actually showed some data about where it's been surging. I think we should all be really careful about how we talk about inequality. In general terms, inequality in the US and income inequality hasn't really risen very much for 20 or 30 years. That's true in the UK as well. Where it has risen is among the very, very wealthiest people. Gabriel Zucman, the French economist who looks at wealth, had some data that has gone viral over the last day or so. And what Zucman does is he looks at, well, it looked to me like it was the top millionth or possibly top 10 millionth of the wealth distribution. I'm not sure that's an enormously useful concept as a share, but fortunately he shows that that's about 4 or 5 households in the early part of the 20th century, but about 17 households, 17 in America right now. So the 17 richest people in the United States. And so they currently, according to Zucman's data, own about 2% of all wealth in America. So that's 17 people owning 2%. I mean, you can divide the American population by 2%. That's about 7 million people, that should be. So that's pretty dramatic. But what's especially dramatic is that that has risen from 1% 20 years ago and from about 0.2, 0.3% 50 years ago. Right? So the share that the very, very wealthiest people in America have has dectupled. And I think that, and that is quite recent. That obviously is related to the enormous fortunes that can be made running a quasi-monopolistic tech company. And it's very hard to think about the story of wealth inequality with this election, and in particular, post-election, without thinking of the role that Elon Musk has played, investing something like $250 million. Someone wrote $250 billion, which I don't think is quite possible for Elon. $250 million in the Trump campaign, and now employing a kind of orc army of 20-year-olds who work for Neuralink to seize control of the Treasury payment system. Something that I noted yesterday has received almost zero coverage in the British press, but feels to me to be more newsworthy than most things that are reported on in the British press. So the Times, for example, yesterday, despite this weekend with the tariffs, and that had half a page on news from the US. And the same amount of space was devoted to a French council asking its employees to pretend to be trees. So I do think we need to take these questions seriously. Elon Musk is an extremely important person. Political scientists like me have a great deal of difficulty in knowing how to theorize about a few extraordinarily powerful people, because I'm afraid in that place we're out of the world of statistics and we're into the world of novels, of Homeric heroes doing things, and that's just very hard to explain and understand. So there's not a lot I can say about that, except, keep your eyes peeled. What I want to do for the rest of my time very quickly is talk about how wealth inequalities impacted support for Donald Trump, because I think it's impacted it in a way that you're not expecting. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have donut holes in their coalition. So the Democrats are a party who receive the support of the poorer third of Americans and then upper middle class sociocultural professionals who live on the coasts. The Republicans receive the support of the very rich, still of the managerial class, and of a large group that would have been referred to in the past as the petty bourgeois, but people sort of in the middle. People who supported Poujade in France and so That's a group of people who have always been attracted to right-wing populism. Work that I did, that Liam has very kindly cited many times, with David Adler a few years ago, which we got a lot of attention on, mostly because of the relationship we found between house prices and Brexit at the end of that piece. No, actually not, because we had to take it out. So this is new for you. We also found that there was a relationship between local house prices at the congressional district level in the 2016 election and support for Donald Trump, particularly as compared to support for Mitt Romney 4 years earlier. What we found was that American homeowners who lived in areas with stagnant or declining house prices are the Trump base. So the group of people who voted for Hillary Clinton were the winners of rising residential wealth in America in the first 15, 20 years of this century. And that's created this weird donut hole style set of coalitions where the Democrats have really picked up among the winners of the tech boom, the finance boom and so on in California, in New England, in where I lived in Minneapolis, lots of wealthy American cities, but homeowners elsewhere, they're not the destitute, they're not the poorest Americans who don't own houses, that third of Americans, they tend to vote for the Democrats. But that large group of people felt left behind, I think felt resentment, a resentment that Richard Nixon had picked up on extremely politically effectively in the 1970s. And Donald Trump's policies in the first term, yes, they benefited the very wealthiest Americans, but where he attacked, where he made life harder for people, other than poorer people, was the upper middle class who had their nice SALT deductions, that's the state and local tax deduction, and their housing mortgage deductions capped. This was a way to essentially punish voters in blue states. And so I think it's just important to keep our head around Trump. It's not the old school Republican-Democrat partisanship where the Republicans are governing on behalf of the top third of income and wealth earners in the United States. Instead, the Republicans are targeting entrepreneurs and business people for tax cuts and punishing kind of high income earners in blue states. I'm not suggesting that that's what the Labour Party should do now, because for those of us who live in North Oxford and are employed by the University of Oxford, that sounds bad. But nonetheless, it's a more complicated story than I think we're used to.
Great.
Great.
Really great. And I'm sure when we get into the discussion, we'll get into what echoes we see of that in the UK and what that means for us. But next up, we have Hamida, please.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much to the Policy Institute and the Fairness Foundation for including us on the panel. For those of you who haven't come across the Future Governance Forum yet, we're a relatively new but fast-growing, progressive but non-partisan think tank, and we're particularly interested in the practical implementation of the how. Lots of policy colleagues looking at the what, but we think it's just as important to spend time thinking about how you're going to do something and not just what. And we're particularly interested in 3 areas, and I might come back to this given the challenge that Liam's put out about the power of missions, but missions and specifically what it means to be mission driven. The Prime Minister talks a lot about being mission driven and not just the actual mission. So focusing a bit on that, on devolution and what that really means in practice, particularly for our communities. Infrastructure and investment, how can we leverage more private investment for public good, and increasingly looking at sort of institutional renewal as well. And we like to be informed and draw our work on a wide network of people who are working in practice, so officials, politicians, and experts from a wide range of backgrounds. So do look us up if you haven't come across us. In terms of my remarks on tonight's topic, I was asked to think about what this means for Labour's response. And Liam, you've already referenced it, but it's a very important and timely discussion given the outcome of that poll. And that's barely 3 months ahead of the first elections following the general election. And the 5th of July for progressives last year was a very important and a big moment, but it feels like it hasn't taken too long to become quite a precarious one. So despite the size of Labour's majority, it still feels quite fragile, built on a relatively low vote share on top of a relatively low turnout. And it's perhaps worth highlighting that Reform came second in 89 of those seats. And barely 7 months into the term, the impact of the very hard yards of governing, of administration, together with the tough economic climate, it feels like it's taken very little time to eat into the goodwill of an electorate that's weary of politics. And the obvious and kind of much discussed lesson from the US election campaign is, of course, that despite having what we covered, the highest growth in the G7, the Democrats couldn't reconcile their economic performance on paper with the reality of the price of bread. And that lesson of lines on a graph are no match for the amount of money in our pockets feels like that's been heard loud and clear by Labour. And you know, if Liam will permit me, let's see how well I do. At FGF, we would argue that the 5 national missions, together with the government's ambition to be mission-driven in how they deliver, do hold the promise of what's needed to create real change in our communities. That hollowed-out state infrastructure, together with a very parlous economic climate, have really generated a level of complexity, we would argue, which requires a fundamentally different approach, that how we've governed in the past isn't fit for purpose for any longer. And that missions do offer a framework to address society's most pressing and intractable challenges. They require more than that sticking plaster. We need new solutions to very long-standing problems. And they should be the boldest expression of ambition. And through our work that we've been doing on what that means to be mission-driven, it would sort of be summarised by the phrase leading with purpose and governing in partnership, and that missions can represent an alternative story for all of us in the country. And through that approach, government understands a humility. It can't achieve the missions on its own. It needs the energy from everyone across the system. So to galvanise, government becomes more of an orchestrator to galvanise the energy across civil society, across communities, across trade unions, across business. And that collective endeavour, where everyone is pulling in the same direction behind a common and shared endeavour, can be a powerful counter to a populist agenda. But I think it comes back to the point, Liam, that you finished on, which is the power of story. So the key question is how this government can demonstrate that it really does matter who runs things, that government really can make change. And we've argued that a key part of that is about storytelling, and that government needs to be able to sort of strike 2 drum beats at once. So on the one hand, sort of hold the bigger inspirational national story towards that longer term prize, whilst addressing the pressing challenges that are facing people right now, and that it can't do one or the other, it really needs to do both. And government's commitment to push power out of Westminster to the regional level, to the local level, is also important, given that if we're going to see progress, that progress is going to be in our communities. Just finally, I wanted to reflect on the question of inequality, perhaps in a different context, and the potential risk of our collective failure over time to tackle inequality successfully. I've worked for a long time in different public sector organisations looking at equality and diversity in terms of our public services and our workplaces. And I think a part of the problem is that the real substance of tackling inequality from that perspective, so I guess from a discrimination point of view, is arguably relatively under-discussed. And at the same time, in recent years, we've seen a relative political consensus on equality being a good thing sort of fall away and giving way to a much more contested environment, particularly under the previous administration, that's become too focused, and I think we've seen this in the US campaign, on almost the bizarre and the surreal. And yet the concept of equality is a universal one, a core principle in our international jurisprudence, which belongs to everyone. And when you think of the actual scale of the problem from that perspective that I think we're talking about when it comes to tackling some aspects of inequality in society, they're core questions for any government: the prevalence of domestic abuse, racial disproportionality of maternal deaths, disabled people more than twice as likely to be unemployed compared to non-disabled people, acute negative chances if you're care experienced, the health inequalities with the North East having the lowest life expectancy of any region in the UK, and that in any of our places, no different in my home in Croydon, that there'll be a decade's disparity from one end of the borough to the other in that life expectancy. And that's just to name a few. And so in my view, we mustn't accept the populist view of equality. Our populist opponents will present outdated arguments, in my view, that this is a zero-sum game, that for my lot to improve, you have to lose something, that jobs and housing and opportunities are at risk for some and have to be sacrificed by some, and that diversity is equivalent to lower standards. But the real fight for equality is for everyone. Equality is a core progressive value, and we should be able to articulate that as progressives more clearly and confidently, that it is universal and that it offers protection to everyone, regardless of background, and is something that should bring us together and not divide us. Thank
you so much, Vida. That was brilliant. And again, I mean, that point about the sense of powerlessness, I think that is a mirror of the system broken feeling. And I think we're doing some work with Tony Travers at the LSE about trying to explore how do people see the boundaries of that powerlessness, what the drivers of that powerlessness, because it goes beyond what the government can do and does do to you. It's more about how you feel in your life generally, where government is an important part. So I think that's two powerful things that are connecting with people, that they have no power and no one can sort it out for them. Thank you so much. Claire?
I was going to start there, actually.
Oh, great.
And just use my remarks to talk a bit about the global context so that we start to understand where we position this and what's just happened in the US in the global context. Talk from the research that PPI have done with Deborah Mattinson, who some of you might know was Keir Starmer's Director of Strategy, on why we think the Democrats lost and Trump won, and then offer some suggestions about how we might move forward. So the global picture then, despite the, I think, brilliant victory with unashamedly partisans in this panel of the UK Labour team in July of last year, we were atypical. The trend generally is a shift to the populist right, and that is being driven by bottom-up pressures. So whilst there might have been a time when we thought, well, if Donald Trump just disappears, we will be able to beat this force, like that is not going to be the case. We could get sort of Trump, Musk, Orban, even Farage. The populist bottom-up pressures that have brought them to the fore are not going anywhere. They are stronger, if anything. So the problem would remain. So what is happening at the sort of elite level in terms of who those leaders are is important, but it's somewhat secondary, I think, to the bottom-up pressures. Majorities in pretty much every developed democracy, interesting bar Poland, who had had an election more recently, feel that their country is going in the wrong direction. And this was a big factor in the US election. And it's not really characterised by a traditional left versus right dynamic, but more of populists versus the alternative. And that's usually the centrists of different political persuasions, or those who represent the status quo or things staying the same. It's not also always about incumbents versus challengers. If you look at Giorgia Meloni's success, she has successfully been able to represent change even in power. In this country, we're not big fans of Donald Trump, but we are not typical of the rest of the world. Our colleagues over at the European Council on Foreign Relations have done some research that shows that the most of the world welcome Trump and see him as a force for good. They see him as a force for good for America and for their country and for peace in the world. We were the outlier. So the drivers of this right-wing surge, they're well documented and analysed. We've talked about some of them. It does, I think, I'd capitulate it around economic, cultural, social insecurity, and that loss of status that I think began in many of our former industrial heartlands has spread to this broader sense of decline and a fear that others are winning at the expense of working. And I think that's spread to the middle class now in many areas. I think the lack of a credible proposition from the centre-left, really since the financial crisis, 2007 and 2008, has contributed to this feeling of instability. And my colleague Mark Lender calls this a new age of unorder. So it's not quite chaos, but it's where we feel subjected to this succession of crises. None of the rules now seem to apply. All institutions and norms are starting to question their legitimacy and efficacy, and fueling that sense that government isn't working for people. And I haven't seen the sort of comparative data for faster growing economies, but for example, if you look at trust in democracy in countries where there's genuinely faster growth, there is a big difference. So growth really matters, not just for the reasons that Rachel said last week, but the relationship between growth and trust, I think, is really important. It's a big problem for centre-left parties because we believe in government. We think the state can be there to do good things, maybe different to what it did in the past, but that gives us a really big political problem if people are starting to question that legitimacy. And when you listen to how this affects people, what came through so strongly in the research that Deborah and I did in the US, but we've done much of the same research in the UK too, is this feeling that people have that their hard work isn't paying anymore, they're doing the right thing, and somebody somewhere else is not operating to the same rules as them. And we were listening to those groups, and it was like, we were listening to some groups in August, this was swing voters in swing states in the US, and it was almost like you were listening to voters. You could change the accent in the place. It was what lots of working class voters would say over here. So, and obviously the big story coming out of the US election is the Democrats not just losing, as they have done, white working class voters, but losing Black Americans, Hispanics in very, very large, significant numbers. So in terms of why the Democrats lost, that wrong direction piece is really important. So 70% of undecided voters said they felt the US was going in the wrong direction. Big problem if you've been vice president for the last few years. This focus that Biden had on the macroeconomy, so talking very much about the amount that the federal government was spending whilst people's own prices were rising. I mean, the price of groceries went up like something like 22% in that period. Gives you a sense of how people were feeling in their pockets, and those big economic inputs just didn't translate. There was a problem in the Democrats' failure to really rebut some of the attacks they got on some of these kind of cultural questions. And what some of the research showed to us was that what voters were starting to object to is, I didn't hear things that I thought were really kind of anti the sort of progressive values that I might have, or anti-equality. But people said they felt judged for saying the wrong thing, or that they were a bad person. So somehow that distance between the Democrats and people had got even larger on some of those cultural issues. Democrats were seen as more extreme. Trump was seen as stronger at standing up to the extreme elements of his party, which was obviously quite a surprise for some of the Democrats that we work with. And then when we asked them about who the Democrats stood for, and I think this talks to the points that Liam was referring to, voters, when they talked about, Deborah did this thing where she looked at like which groups would do well if Harris was elected, and people struggled to pick anyone out, but then they eventually would pick a line of what looked like migrants queuing at the border, or a group of activists. Then you'd ask them, well, who's going to do well if Trump wins? And they'll first go to the really rich businessmen. But they also picked small business owners, and they picked families. So it reflects the who votes for. And there was a real gap on who actually spoke for the working person. So there is an opportunity there, I think, for Democrats. But my colleagues in the US will be arguing very strongly they have to change tack to start prioritising non-college voters. They're never, ever going to win by just targeting college voters. And there is a warning here, of course, for us too, that focus we have in opposition on working people needs to be as focused in government too. So what next? Because this is a bit of a bleak picture. I think we are at the turning point now. I don't think we were in 2016. I think Brexit was a warning shot, actually, that vote. I don't think we have had our populist moment yet, and I hope we don't get there. I think that the Labour Party did win the election, but I think the global centre-left is losing the war. Class is at the absolute centre of this. So the populist right wants to redraw the electoral map of class. Like, that is a primary goal for them, and that's running through all of their strategies. This is really dangerous. Labour were almost unique in being able to reverse that trend that has been affecting centre-left parties of losing working class support. They won a majority of working class support at the last election. But as we've just seen about the polling, this is becoming a problem for them again. But as our problem started with class, I think that's where our solution starts from too. I think that much of this is about people feeling that sense of loss and anxiety post kind of whatever you would call it, hyper-globalization, and people needing to know what their identity is. And I think being able to have a stronger sense of an inclusive national identity is at the core, and you can run that through our economic policy, you can run that through our cultural policy, and our social politics too. I think it's about who we are and who we stand for, starting with having more non-graduates as candidates and those sorts of things, so that we are speaking not just about people, but for them too. It's about how we communicate. But ultimately, I think this is about giving people a sense of their place in the world and us being able to be the people that stand up for them. So, you know, I mean, Liam touched on some of kind of the policies, but really kind of using this focus on living standards and giving people the tools to remake the deal themselves, that it's their hard work. Like, on the whole, people don't want massive redistribution answers. I really think they're an important part of what we should do, but they want to be able to know that it's their effect, their power, their agency that is fueling them on. I think we have to have a big programme on reinventing government so that it works for ordinary people. It just, you know, that's not how, when I was listening to the news this morning and like how much council tax is going up by, and I'm thinking, God, if you're a resident in Birmingham, you're thinking, really? You know, those sorts of pressures that we need to be not apologetic at. We need to be reinventing government. Having a realistic and credible path to energy transition, I think that's going to be an important part of it. And this fostering a stronger, inclusive national identity with actual managed and controlled immigration, that we, I think, are the people that can lead that. So there's political action, there's policy action, there's lots of things that we can do, community organising, strengthening those bonds. There's a whole programme of things. I think we have to have our own cultural problem, cultural story to deal with a problem that a lot of people are getting to politics as a result of being influenced by messages much further upstream. We're getting to young people far too late. So we need a cultural programme too. And I think, finally, I would say there is pressure on the Conservatives now to reject extreme politics. What the mainstream, we know from Europe, what the mainstream centre-right party does is really important. What the CDU do in Germany, I think, is going to be extremely important. If there are Conservative supporters here listening, if you talk to them, they can't sit this one out. They absolutely have to stay down that centre line, because it will really matter to how much people are drawn to it. So I think there's action for everybody here. The parties themselves can only do so much, but I think there is a call to arms in this now, because we can't just be let off the hook just because Labour were elected last year.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. That's brilliant. And just to pick up on one little thing you said about class, I mean, that is interesting, because with all of the focus on culture war divisions, all those types of things, you do forget that kind of sense of class division within. But we did a little poll that we're updating lots of old polls with John Rentoul from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And in 1964, less than half of people thought there was class struggle in the UK. We did it in 2024, and 3/4 of people think there's class struggle in the UK. So there is, it may mean something different now to people, it may have shifted in its concept, but the idea that we've lost that sense that there is a class struggle is just not right among the public. They feel that very much. So finally, Peter.
Good. Well, we are responsible for Trump. It is our fault. We, I suggest, are the centrists, the progressives, the Remainers. We have given the space, made the mistakes. I wrote down the 7 deadly sins of how we show up. This is how we are seen. We're seen as patronising. We believe that we're the clever ones with the university degrees, our metropolitan lives, our greater expertise. From the comfort of knowing that money is coming through the door at regular intervals, we look down on those who are not living by our rules. Second, we're complacent. We believe that the logic of our position will win out in the end and that people will see the light. And we believe that emotional appeals are slightly grubby. Yet that rational appeal falls on deaf ears if trust is low and you haven't made a connection. Third, we're abstract. The populists speak in direct terms, and too often we speak in riddles. We are systems thinkers, which is good for solving problems, but when we communicate, A plus B rarely equals C. We're censorious, as others have said. We are the thought police. We cancel those who fall short of the right kind of virtue signalling, or who refuse to go along with our latest linguistic contortions. We are in the shame game, and people don't like being shamed. We're gullible. We are suckers for the bait. We stop to examine every turd a Trump or a wannabe Trump drops on the sidewalk, every wind-up remark, anti-woke sentiment, sexual innuendo. We do more than that. We crowd around the turd, we pick it up, we sniff it, we debate it. We lose focus, we get diverted, we stop connecting to the people we want to serve, and we meander away from the mainstream. Meanwhile, the populist is marching forward with the smirk of someone who knows he's got one over on us yet again. We're conservative. We win when we are the agents of change and when we shape the future, yet we have a caution born of fear, of the far right, of the far left, of the media, of failing. Yet too often we get boxed into defending institutions that aren't working, giving away the mantle of change, which is the very purpose of the centre-left, too easily, allowing others to become the disruptors on behalf of the people that we once served. And we are bland. In a world of entertainment, we do not surprise or amuse or anger or excite or charm. Our range of emotions starts at earnest and ends at sincere. We are the tick-tock of an antique carriage clock, not the viral clip. And no, asking a teenager to add some sparkle to our social media pages will not work if the content remains bland. Those are the 7 deadly sins of... So the way we show up matters. We don't get permission to be listened to if we don't correct those 7 deadly sins. The 2 academics that I think have made the most impression on me who've told this story in a powerful way. One is Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist. She wrote a book. She's just written a new book on shame. Her famous one is called Strangers in Their Own Land. And she called it, and I think we should be after this, having listened and immersed herself in the world of, in those days, the Tea Party, the forerunner to Trump. She spent 5 years living in those communities. She talked about what's called the deep story, and I like that phrase. It's the underlying story of what's going on. And she used this metaphor that became quite well known. Some of you will have heard it, which is that these white working class Americans are waiting in line for the American dream, which is above the brow of the hill. And every time they think they're getting closer to the American dream, the Democrats put in front of them in the queue a different group that is not them. And that is how they see, that is what she felt after a long time, is how they saw themselves. Michael Sandel, who you will also know, is equally good at talking about the difference between the college-educated and the non-college educated. So to answer the specific question here about inequality, and others have touched on this is about an inequality of wealth, yes, but it's an inequality of status, and it's an inequality of lifestyle. And he puts it so well, Sandel, which is if, and I remember in the days I worked for Tony Blair, this was a case, and Bill Clinton was the same, that if the mantra is the more you learn, the more you earn, so getting to university is the thing to aim for. If you then don't go to university, you believe one of 2 things, possibly more, one of 2. Either you're too lazy in some way, or you've got something wrong about you, or you're too stupid. So you start off, because that's the great aspiration for everyone, as being seen as wrong to begin with. You then, because the more you learn, the more you earn is basically true, you're earning less. Then you're told by the metropolitan elite that you're, in the case of America, your church-going, gun-owning, small-town America or rural America lifestyle is not sufficiently woke enough. So on all those levels, there is inequality. And I think that is the sort of starting point for understanding what was going on. And the Democrats simply were miles away from getting that story. Now, I think Keir in particular, with his story about respect and his own personal upbringing, has actually connected in that way, but in a way less so in government when you've got all the sort of stuff going on. But I think we've got to reconnect with that particular respect agenda. The 3 areas I think we've got to do the heavy lifting, others have touched on it in slightly different ways. One is a new economic model. You can't have an economic policy and an economic model that is delivering stagnant wages and flatlining or lower living standards over a long period of time, and the inequality of income and wealth, as Liam has written about in his brilliant book, which I have just finished and is fantastic and worth buying at the end. He hasn't paid me to say that. And so we need a new economic model. This reform of the state, I think I'd go further than others. And I saw it on the receiving end, I've been both in government and receiving end, sort of on the front line running schools. It is completely broken, and we shouldn't pretend it isn't in this country. And it's broken on sort of two levels. On the big scandal level, you have to just look at the post office scandal or infected blood or Windrush or Hillsborough or Grenfell to know that this is a state that has got many problems. That's a sort of big scandal. On the day-to-day, 8 million waiting for treatment in the health service, trains that don't run on time, etc., etc. This is not a state that is functioning well. And when you, at the same time, you say there's 7,000 communication officers in the civil service, 1,000 HR personnel in the cabinet office. A permanent secretary said to me the other day, I would bite your hand off to have half the number of civil servants in my department, but pay them twice as much, because if they want to buy a house in London, or the senior ones, the best ones, leave to be paid 100,000 more at PwC, so I can't retain them. Is that going to happen? No, because the forces will stop him doing that. So there are people who want to do things to reform. I think we need a smaller state, a more strategic state, a state that devolves power, a state that catalyzes. So the idea of draining the swamp, we've got to admit that there is a swamp, and we've got to do something about it, but do it in the right way. So that's on reforming the state. And then the third one, which echoes what other people said, is we've got to tell a national story. The left in particular is squeamish about anything that feels patriotic. The best we do is put a Union Jack behind a politician. And we've actually got to draw on our history in a cleverer way and then pull it through to a story about the future. It was spectacular that when I was in America, the complete absence of a Democrat and a Kamala Harris response to MAGA. And MAGA has become a powerful, hopeful movement to make America great again. And we need, it's interesting already, Farage is saying make Britain great again. And I think a lot on the left feel that's a bit much, and could we really say that? Why on earth couldn't we say that? Why can't Keir Starmer say that? And we've got to have a language and a confidence about our national story. So those are the three things that I think will make the biggest difference. Economy, reforming the state, national story is going to help us get in the right place.
Brilliant. So that was amazing. Thank you so much, Peter, and all panelists. So what I've got on my list now is a response from Liam. So I'm glad to hand this over to you, Liam.
Well, I think what's quite striking is the degree of consensus. I mean, you don't often get a level of consensus like that after in an analysis of an election. But I think maybe I would start with Claire's point, really, which is that things can get worse, actually. And I think, you know, for many politicians of my generation, you know, our political lives have been defined by the glades that opened up after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And, you know, for many of us, that era basically ended with Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. But actually, you could probably date it back a little further to the great financial crash, when things in our model really began to go haywire. And so I think our mindset actually has got to be that we are now quite definitively into a very new era in which things could actually get dramatically worse. And I think what that means for me is the politics of scarcity becomes much more profound. And when you've got people worried much more about scarcity, then zero-sum politics becomes really problematic. And so if you think about the populist basic model, you know, populists are not nationalists. Nationalists are people who kind of really privilege the nation. Populists are tribalists. They believe in divide and rule. They're not trying to bring people together around the national story in order to overshadow a neighbour. They're trying to divide a country up and win through the middle. And so I think this point about national story really is fundamental in reimagining, in recreating some glue, frankly, that kind of brings people together. And I think Peter is absolutely right to say that that has absolutely got to draw on our history, reinvent it for new times. I won't say much about this kind of second point of state reform because, again, this has really emerged as a very striking point of consensus. But where the ideas are for reinventing government, I'm really not sure. I was very struck in a conversation I was having with Peter a couple of weeks ago when I began working for the Blair office back in 95, 96. I was told very clearly by David Miliband that reinventing government was fundamentally important, because if you wanted people to believe in a party that thought government was a good thing, then you needed to absolutely show that government was going to deliver. But the final point, I suppose, was this point about equality, and just to sort of tie a link back to Ben. So the changes that could unfold over the next 10 to 20 years could be extraordinary. The revolution in genetic medicine, the advent of global gigabit connectivity, the transition to green energy, there is still the rise of the global middle class that is underway. When Kristalina Georgieva gave a speech a year or two ago, she was asked, how could living standards change over the course of this century? If you answer that question, what are the economic prospects of our grandchildren? What's the answer to that? And the answer was, well, if we make good decisions, living standards could improve 13-fold over the course of the century to come. But who gets to enjoy that will depend on whether we fix inequality. It could be that new growth in wealth just goes to a very lucky few. If you want to democratize progress, you've got to think about the answer to the question, equality of what? And this is where I would go to a very old British tradition, goes back to the Magna Carta. We've always sought to democratize progress by enlarging rights. But the rights that people need for the years ahead are different. We need things like the right to work, the right to a home, the right to food, the right to nature, the right to mobility. And maybe they're not kind of hard rights as you'd put in the European Charter of Human Rights, but they could be civic rights. That's how we democratize progress. But the final piece of that puzzle is to recognize that it's through rights that we enlarge freedoms. And we could be telling an imaginative story about the expansion of freedom over the years to come. What's distinctive about the left-wing account of that is that we know, as Franklin Roosevelt said all those years ago, there is no freedom without security, and there is no security without wealth. And so leaning into an optimistic account of the future, telling a bold and imaginative story about how we're going to throw back the frontiers of freedom, but actually how we're going to ironclad that with some new ways of cooperating to build security and to root that in a more democratization of wealth, I think could be a project that people could get behind. And actually, you can turn that into narratives that you can put on leaflets and having conversations in under 60 seconds on a doorstep. Why? Because it trades on our history, but it also trades on the unique role of the left in British politics. So, I'm struck by a level of consensus, and I'm actually feeling more optimistic than I did at the beginning of the talk.
Excellent.
So that's a good night for Liam.
That is good. What a great outcome. Even with our 7 deadly sins, that's a great outcome. So if there's nothing else immediate from the panel, I think as well as an amazing panel, we've got a really high-powered audience here as well. I can see loads and loads of people who've thought long and hard about these types of issues. So I think we will go to questions, and I think we've got microphones coming. You do need the microphones for the room. I did see you first, which is a wide one. So just we'll take 2 or 3 at a time. Just say who you are and where you're from.
Hi, Johnny Dudley. So I think it's fair to say we accepted that Poland is probably one example where people feel that change is bringing about positivity. Is that also the one place where Tusk has been quite sort of muscularly anti-authoritarian? He's pushed against, the legacy in the media, court reform. Biden similarly was very respectful of institutions, going to it, but Dems didn't sack the Senate parliamentarian. They played within the rules. They didn't go quickly on prosecuting Trump. Is it not fair to say that Labour have got a big stinking majority and aren't willing to push planning reform quickly? Is the answer not that actually they need to have a fight? The fight is the point. It shows leadership. It shows a desire to make change. And that's where we need to go.
Great. Yeah, so parallel with you. Any others? There was some in the middle here. Yep. Sorry, you've got to come forward. Yep. There we go.
Thank you.
Oh, great.
I'm somewhat promiscuous. I go to all sorts of things. What I remember is during the Corbynista time, The people that turned up at the meeting believed they were the agents of change. Yesterday, I went to a reform meeting, and the people there believed they were the agents of change. I believe it's a rejection that you are the agents of change, that you are actually going to do it to them. And Peter there nailed it in his talk, and I will guarantee that his conclusions are totally ignored when it actually comes to you actually doing something.
Great. Less of a question, more of a challenge. It's
more of a gauntlet.
Do you agree?
It's got a gauntlet. That is a good gauntlet. And we have someone, excuse me, just this way. Just down the front here. Great. So we'll take these three and then we've got lots of time for another round. Don't worry.
Thanks for the excellent panel. I work at an organization called Just Fair, and we work to advance economic, social, and cultural rights across the UK. And my question is whether you see what is the role of law and legal mechanisms to advance social rights like health, housing, education in the UK to combat and tackle the inequality problems that you were addressing. Thank you.
Great. So I think, if you don't mind, I'll just start going around the panel, pick what you like, and then we'll make sure we cover them all.
Yeah, I'll go to the first question, because I wrote a piece on my Substack. That's my, personal sales pitch there. It's free, so it's not much of a sales pitch. A few weeks ago, which I called, because I love a pun, Profiles in Discourage. I feel that the party in government has been acting like it expected to be in government about now. And this whole period from July onwards was a phony war. And I do think that, I mean, this came out in a way in Claire and Peter's account of what's been successful about MAGA, is that this is a don't just stand there, do something moment. And you can see there's been a bit of a change, I think, in Reeves particularly, but also maybe to some degree in Starmer, in a good God, we've just got to do something now. We have an enormous majority. It's deeply impressive to have 2/3 of the seats in Parliament on 1/3 of the vote. Given you've been that lucky, don't sit there and feel guilty about it. Do something with it.
Very good. Thank you, Ben. Claire, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree with the points on both. You have to be the agent of change, and I think Labour have historically been the agents of change, and I think you can see that tension playing out when sometimes they're called upon to defend something that is nothing to do with them, and therefore if they don't kind of capture that spirit, others will do that for them, because that's the force that we've seen elsewhere. And yeah, I totally agree on the fight. Labour seems to be having quite a lot of fights at the moment. So to your point, they might want to be more strategic about where they're choosing those fights, because actually there is a story there's a story to be told about why those fights have been picked, whether you agree with it or not. Actually, there is a really strong story. I mean, they did protect and fight for working people. Tomorrow, the minimum wage goes up again. They're doing a whole bunch of things which are actually going to make them, in large places, more unpopular, but we also, to Mita's point, really need that story to come through about why they're doing what they're doing to even stand a chance, I think, to be up against what they might be up against.
Yeah, I mean, I think this point about fight and agents of change is sort of super important too. So what's quite interesting about the populists who have won is they're not new. They've all actually been around quite a long time. Donald Trump's a known quantity, Meloni's a known quantity, Farage is a known quantity, Wilders in Holland is a known quantity. So in a sense, voters across the West have got to the point where they're so sick and tired of the lack of progress, they're so pessimistic about the future, they're prepared to roll the dice, but with known quantities. So it's a kind of a limited risk, but nonetheless, that gives me a kind of a reassurance in a way that actually insurgent-like behaviour is sort of perfectly possible. You don't have to be sort of so far out with the mainstream to be credible. You just need to have a story to tell. But you know, the thing that I suppose has really struck me after 20 years in politics is now that drama and democracy are just intimately related. You know, there is a reason that the Greeks built a theatre halfway up the hill to the Acropolis, because you needed the drama to light up the conflict, and you needed the democracy to try and provide the reconciliation of consensus. And what I think people often who are in politics, and I used to be guilty of this, goodness knows, you know, when you become just so overly technocratic, actually, you forget that you do need a degree of conflict, because actually there's no drama without conflict, and it's really difficult to light up the issues at stake. And so, you know, I kind of agree with Claire on this. Some strategic fights are supremely important. And something that Peter said really reminded me of a speech that Keir Starmer gave it was his first speech in Birmingham, actually. It was the last speech that my dear friend Jack Dromey listened to from Keir. And what Keir did in that speech is put the notion of dignity centre stage. And there is a real inequality of dignity here today. And people who are prepared to fight for the dignity of working people would go a long way. And it's just one of the things I've noticed on the Business and Trade Committee a lot over the last sort of 2 or 3 months. We've been doing a lot of work on companies like Amazon and Every, Sports Direct, and today we had those nice people from Ticketmaster in front of us. And you know, the response that we've had to those hearings has just really knocked me sideways, because basically what people have kind of said in all the kind of comments on the media and social media is this: finally someone's taking these bastards on. You know, and so there's a real sense that life has just now become so unfair, and those with power are just being allowed to kind of get away with it, and people want a kind of a tribune of the working class again. And for a long time they've been asking, well, where is the Labour Party in that particular battle? So I do think strategic fights are right, because actually if you don't have that credential of an agent of change anymore, then actually the ceiling on what you can do in politics is pretty low.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just a couple of points. One, perhaps on Johnny's question, and perhaps it's Claire's point about which fights that you choose. And you gave planning reform as an example. I suppose it kind of brings me back to the complexity of the extent to which our systems are broken. So, you know, in London, for example, there's something like 230,000 planning permissions out there that haven't been built. Like, is the planning system itself? It's not the only challenge in the system. I think councils across London are spending 4 million every day on temporary accommodation. 1 in 50 Londoners is homeless. 1 in 21 children are in temporary accommodation. The 1.5 million homes that we desperately need, are they going to address the affordability question to change that situation for people? So, I mean, I agree on the which fights do we choose, but there's a complexity in some of the extent to which things are broken. I also wanted to come to the third questioner about the role of law in achieving some of the equality that we want to see. And I suppose I would say it's a really important part of setting standards, but it doesn't secure justice on its own. And I think about, for example, Claire talked about what's coming down the track with lots of budgets for councils and council tax setting, the special educational needs and disability budgets. And as a former councillor and former council leader, having seen it more and more difficult for councils to be able to meet the needs of children in their communities. And yet those who were able to take to judicial review are those that had that social capital, had that financial resource to take those cases. It feels like even on the cases of discrimination, I think some of the first people who were prosecuted under the racially aggravated criminal offences were from a Black, Asian or minority ethnic background. There's something about, you know, the legal system doesn't necessarily secure the justice always that it seeks to, but obviously it's a really important fundamental principle to have those stakes in the ground.
We can learn so much from what Trump's doing in the first 2 weeks, I think. This idea of sort of what are the rules of the game. It's another thing we get wrong in the Senate. We sort of go think the rules of the game are working. Right. And it's interesting, your point about reform, having gone to a reform meet. In America, when I was going to Trump rallies, it was striking how many people had voted for Bernie Sanders or were sympathetic to him. And when you listen to the speeches at the Trump rallies, the first half could have been said by Bernie Sanders, because they were a critique about how basically the oligarchs or the big business or whatever had screwing ordinary working people. And so obviously there were different solutions at the end, but there was an argument there. And what Bernie Sanders said in a very good critique of sort of Kamala Harris losing the election is he said, up against Trump, who did have an argument, she had no argument. And so you've got to, I mean, it's partly storytelling, but it's also sort of making the case in a stronger way of what you think is wrong with society and therefore what needs to be changed. And we've got to be far more confident about doing that. The slightly less reassuring, just aside on what Liam said on the known quantities, is Romania, where I did a little bit of work. I mean, that presidential election, which was then suspended, the first round of that, there were already 2 far-right candidates in the race, and a third one came from nowhere on the back of a viral TikTok campaign, mostly of him playing judo and riding horses. So, I mean, that was a chilling example of where, I mean, it backs up everyone else's point. If the mainstream and the centre doesn't hold, then anything is then possible. And it could be a known, but it could be an unknown, I think.
Very good. So we got one. This is the final round, and I can only take a couple. We go out wide again, and then we'll come back in. And yeah, please.
Thank you so much. I'm fascinated by the reality and the perception that Trump is going to be good for both the 0.01% and also the extremely economically disadvantaged white working class. A little bit related to what you've just spoken about, but what is the narrative within that group of how he can do both? How can he be for the billionaires whilst protecting the interests of the working class, and what can we learn from that?
Very good. Just go straight back to, yeah, great.
Hi, Gabby Hinsler from The Guardian. This is, I suppose, initially a question for Claire, but for everyone really. You talked about bringing back some of the focus that you had in opposition on kind of hero voters into government as well, and there are some obvious examples of where that's happening. You know, kind of you mentioned minimum wage, public sector pay rises, workers' rights bill. But are there tricks that you think are missing there that you can be specific about? And are there tensions between quite a lot of those, and also some of what Liam was talking about, kind of very sort of pro-consumer sort of agenda? Are there tensions between some of those and a government that's obsessed with growth, anything for growth, already a bit worried about how much they may have upset employers? And is there a tension between that and a more worker-based agenda?
Great. And go back on the end there.
Will Hutton, from the Fairness Foundation, I guess. Just to kind of point out a couple of things that I was reflecting on. In particular, I want to pick up something that both Claire and Peter Hyman said when you're thinking about kind of the subject of this kind of talk. And it's this, that I think that this sense of being talked down to picking up what Claire said and Peter's point about kind of the smugness, if you like. I mean, I do think that you're slightly underplaying, in my view at least, the extreme success that Trump and the cohorts around him had in actually making immense political capital out of the woke. It was that the best ad was the most watched ad, and the ad which allegedly kind of persuaded most people to move was the one which kind of said, you know, we're not for them, we're for you. Kind of a play on woke, which actually was incredibly successful. And lots of other kind of subtext throughout the campaign. And I think that kind of Friends of American Prospect, which I did a very interesting analysis of actually who, when you went down the ticket, kind of what candidates actually kind of outperformed or underperformed. And on the Democratic ticket, down the slate, every candidate performed well, who actually spoke to kind of traditional orthodox Bernie Sanders working class concerns and policies. And actually anyone who lent into a Kamala Harris kind of woke world was caned. So I think that, I think it's important to kind of just point those things up when talking about this, because I think that when you start to think about how that reproduces itself in a British context, a lot of that doesn't travel actually to, the woke doesn't kind of quite have the same resonance here, although some dimensions do. And in terms of a kind of national story, surely Liam is sitting on it, I think. There or thereabouts, there lies something. And actually one note of optimism, which others may disagree with, but I think might kind of start to be more salient over the next kind of 2, 3, 4 years, is actually, and I think Keir Starmer should make much more of a commitment to spend 3% of GDP on defence. And he should argue that the next round of tax raising, which is inevitable, and a wealth tax through kind of reframing council tax will be hypothecated for that and that end. And actually you would really put reform and the Conservative Party on the defensive. I don't think things are quite as shallow here as kind of some of the speakers have suggested. I think the kind of the position is reclaimable, but it does require some determination from our leaders.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So, if you don't mind, I'll go in reverse order of speakers. So maybe it's actually going to you first, Peter.
I think in answer to the question about the narrative and the billionaires and others, it's interesting again at the Trump rallies, there was this thing about him being a businessman who knew what he was doing on the economy. And actually they said quite openly, we know he will benefit himself and his chums first, but we actually think by doing the right thing for the economy, unlike what they saw as Kamala Harris having no economic message, that would benefit the majority of people. So again, they were very knowing. I was struck, and again, just as an aside, the number of people who came up to me at Trump rallies, these are the sort of big supporters, saying, we know he's an arsehole talking about Trump. We know he says things he shouldn't be saying, but he's doing that because that's what you've got to do to get cut through against the mainstream. You've got to make a fuss, you've got to break eggs, you've got to say unorthodox things. And if he was being polite and collaborative, he wouldn't be the disruptor that we're trying to vote for. So whereas we were horrified by what he was saying and kept saying, the number of people who kept saying to me, doesn't this disqualify him from getting elected? In the mind of all those voters, it qualified him because it showed he was willing to be a disruptor. So we need to be right about that. I basically agree with what Will was saying, including on, I think the defence thing's interesting. I think it's a clever move. You've got to weigh up, public services and other things about what you want to do. But I think that makes sense. And I think the woke thing. Look, you don't want to backlash. What I always say, and this is where, when we go back to storytelling, it's the confidence and courage of your own convictions of deciding where to draw the line. Politics is all about where you place the line. So it seems to me at the heart, it's been brilliantly now sort of distorted, and the Democrats played a big part in that, to say, and it's been trivialized, if you like, the woke agenda, but it was based on proper things. Black Lives Matter started with the brutal deaths of innocent people by the police. It was a real thing. The Me Too movement started with real sexual assaults and rapes on women. These are not sort of, it then gets distorted to pronouns and all the rest of it, but it started with, so a sophisticated, by sophisticated I meant just put the light, you can still be blunt about it. You've got to decide which bits of the agenda matter and are real, and which bits are sort of the nonsense around the edges. And as you were saying, Hamida, it's all then about telling a universal message where everyone can benefit, which was the problem with the Democrats, rather than the sort of disaggregated identity messages.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. Claire,
Sure thing. So, just on the question about voters sort of holding intention, they're like, who you support. I listened mainly to swing voters, so they weren't people that were, they weren't at the rallies Peter was at. But lots of swing voters, they didn't love Trump. Like, they knew he came with a lot of baggage. He won, but you know, it's not as decisive as he's now showing. People were just so fed up of the same old, not delivering for them. And they were just too unsure about the Democrats. They didn't know really what the Democrats' story, argument, offer was. Actually, she had some pretty good policy, given that she had no time at all really to put it together. The stuff that she was starting to say on price gouging, I thought, oh, you're getting, to Gabby's point, you're getting somewhere there, but they hadn't got time to be able to really kind of work that up. So it wasn't really that, you know, America is full square behind Donald Trump, but there are a lot of people who are unsure, and the economics was the biggest thing in the end. I totally take the point, you know, the sort of cultural story, the kind of anti-woke stuff. I mean, that was the most effective attack you know, that they could have had in terms of what they did to Harris. But that sort of just the Democrats not speaking to their everyday worries about costs going up really kind of did a lot of damage to them. In terms of Gabby's question about for Labour, I mean, Labour should be very proud of the fact that it reversed that trend that has happened elsewhere. That was no accident. That was a lot of work by Keir Starmer and the Labour Party for a very long time to decide what electoral strategy they were going to have and to pursue it. I think the things that they could do, they're doing lots of things I think that could tell this story, but I think they could tell that story really overtly and proudly. So when I was pleased when Rachel's speech last week, she made it clear that the reason we are going for growth is because it's how you drive better living standards for working people. So making that connection, I think, is really, really important. There's lots of things we're already doing. Minimum wage is one thing. Actually, I think making a virtue of the employment rights legislation coming through, I think is really important. It's actually really popular. You know, people want flexible working. They don't want to be done over. We don't want this race to the bottom. Freezing fuel duty in the budget. There were lots of things that I would like to see amplified. I think an area where I think they could move on would be around really people's essential costs. So, you know, Liam was talking about Ticketmaster there. I think where you feel that there are kind of companies that are providing essential goods and services, like what can we on the centre left do to say how might we bear down on those sorts of things. So those sorts of things which are picking a fight, but where people feel that market is broken and they feel they're ready for some solutions, I think there's fertile ground.
Great. Hamida, anything to add?
Thank you. Yeah, perhaps just to pick up where Peter left off in response to Will's contribution. I mean, it's good to know, Will, your sense is that kind of the intensity perhaps of the scale around the woke challenge doesn't travel perhaps in the same way. But it's certainly not new either. So when I started working on equality and diversity in local government, like 25 years ago, it was political correctness gone mad was the phrase, and it was kind of quite a similar idea. Whereas Peter describes this kind of odd sort of on the margins examples dominate the conversation and the discourse, when actually there are real life chances, issues at play here that do require genuine kind of public policy response and help maintain that cohesion with us as a society. Interestingly, I heard Wes Streeting being interviewed by Nick Robinson in an event that Macmillan staged today as part of World Cancer Day, and he perhaps responded to your challenge, Peter, about sort of having that confidence and clarity that you don't need to accept the way in which it is framed by some, and you can be really confident and frame that as an important value that is about ensuring that there are the health inequalities that we experience in this country are tackled, whether that's around maternal deaths or around access to cancer treatment, and locating it in the context of, you know, we all pay for our public services, we all have that kind of contributory principle, we have that sense of a society, and that it's in that context that these issues of equality from that point of view, from a discrimination point of view, are important, as opposed to the margins of the nonsense, you know, from a much more common sense point of view.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I'll come back to this question about this interesting alliance in the Republican Party. I think it's an alliance among people who experience capitalism red in tooth and claw, who have jobs in the private sector, that's the working class base, who are small business owners, who, by the way, you know, every analysis we political scientists ever do of small business owners, they're always most attracted to populist positions going back decades and decades. And then the people at the very top, they are up against people who work in government, people who work for charities, or people who work for large, insulated, tech or educational corporations. And the Democrats, and I think this is true for Labour as well, and you'll excuse me for the way I put this, started in a party for losers that became a party of the winners. And they don't quite know how to handle that transition. But what is true about government, about charities, about universities, certainly about large tech corporations until about 3 weeks ago, is that they have a way of speaking. They have a series of, an etiquette, a series of norms that govern every interaction you have with people that strikes people outside of that world as just plain weird. So part of wokeness is the bureaucratization of a bunch of totally understandable concerns that Peter, spoke about quite clearly there, right? About Black Lives Matter, that transitions from being a almost universally shared sense of disgust about what happened to a series of corporate rules and norms. And it's that smugness, it's that superciliousness, and frankly, it's just that plain bureaucratization that the Democrats need to get out of, because they're stuck right in that, and Labour need to avoid getting in. I want to finish with one thing. I think it's brilliant that everybody's been taking Trump seriously and on the level and trying to look for positives in what's happening, and stories in what's happening. In a year or two's time, I lived in the States from 2000 to 2013, so I remember the years 2005 to 2009, when the Bush was astride the world. He won a majority, which Trump didn't quite do in that presidential election. And within a year, he was on his knees. And the next 3 years were a rolling disaster. So I would be very careful about betting the horse on Trump succeeding. He might, but he might not.
Great. Okay, final words.
Well, just to, the polling that I saw that was shared with me last week was that, there were about sort of 30-40% of people who thought, who liked Trump and liked his policies. 30-40% of people who hated Trump, hated his policies, and then that bit in the middle were the people who hated Trump but actually quite liked his policies. And I think, that gives me some confidence that, you can win back. I suppose I just want to come back to this point about what politics is for, really, because ultimately, that's the story that we've got to tell, and that's the argument that we've got to win. And, I think there are different ways to put this. So, I wrote something last year about how Labour needs to take back the narrative about freedom. We need to be the party that says we're going to expand your freedom. I think, Peter, you said to me at the time, well, look, we never really used that word. We would talk about expanding opportunity. But there's something about giving you the freedom to be you, to live the life that you want to live, to be aspirational about that, to give you options, agency, perhaps it is control over the future of life that you just don't think you've got today because you are powerless. And you're the kind of victim, if you like, of great systems which are ranged against you. And actually, that's why we invented the Labour Party. It goes back to the days of the Levellers. We were always the group of people in town who said, look, if we kind of get together and fight for this, then actually we can expand and enlarge the opportunities, the horizons that we can all shoot for. But today, people don't think that's the country that we live in. People will think today that we live in an inheritocracy where the most powerful people in the country are no longer the national government, but the richest people. Where people now think that it's not hard work that gets you on, it's actually the family that you're born into, or the friends and the networks that you've got. Hard work is now only third on the list on the qualities that people think it takes to get on in life. That's how bad things have become. And I suppose, my argument to Labour is, trade on what's gone well in the past, but we've got to be that party that believes in dignity of working people, and we've got to be the champion of working people and the fighters for working people. But we've got to remember the way in which work has changed since 1944, 1945. There was a brilliant book that was published under the Attlee government, which was just about work. I think it was called Work, in fact. And it was just full of pictures of people who were at work. And I think sort of too often today, we don't really associate ourselves with the reality of the way people work. And my sort of final exemplification of this is, as some of you know, I grew up in Harlow in Essex, and I've sort of just about lost the white socks. But I started my working life as a white van driver. And when I ran for mayor in the West Midlands, I said, look, one of the things that we ought to be trying to do is we ought to associate ourselves with the way that people actually work today. We should do a white van manifesto. We should be the party that writes a manifesto for white man, van and women. How many members of the Labour Party in the West Midlands do you think own a white van? One. And he had a really bad hangover that morning because it was his birthday the night before, but we made him come over to borrow his van to launch this white van manifesto. And, it's a silly story in a way, but it kind of tries to light up a basic point that we have to show that we are the party of working people no matter where they work, but we are the party that are going to help people turn work into fruits of their labour that they get to enjoy. And I suppose that's my answer to Gabby's question, really, which is that unless we can show how we will help people, not just work well, not just lean into their vocation, but actually turn that into wealth and assets which they can use to build a good life, whether that's a home to call their own, whether it is a pension for their golden years, or whether it's savings for a rainy day. Unless we can show how people build those assets, then people won't feel safe and secure, and they certainly won't feel that this is a country which works for them. And so for me, that's the big fight we've got to win.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Liam. Wow. Well, that was incredibly rich discussion. I'm exhausted after that. I can tell you are too. So it's time for refreshments, which we'll have at the back. Before I do my thanks, just to flag for people who are interested in this series, we've got another brilliant event, I think, in this room in a couple of weeks' time on China, Trump's implications for relationship with China, with the brilliant Professor Kerry Brown and lots of others talking about that. So we're continuing that series. So only up to me now to say thank you very much to the Fairness Foundation and Will Snell for this great series, to the team at the Policy Institute, Sophia, Hugh, George at the back and putting it together, for you all for coming, and to our absolutely brilliant panel, and of course Liam, whose book is right there waiting. Refreshments or book, it's your choice. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant.
Really good. Really good.